All right, so today we're going to dive into, we're going to take a look at a really interesting kind of power shift happening inside Iran.
Okay.
And you've, sent me some really interesting stuff, laying out how this group,
Yeah.
the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC,
Yeah.
they've really kind of transformed themselves
Yeah.
from, what started as like a revolutionary militia into, what a lot of people would argue is the dominant economic and political force in the country.
Yeah. And what's so fascinating about this is that your sources really lay out how this was such a quiet evolution. Like
Yeah.
it really happened under the radar. And the goal here, I think, for this deep dive is to really understand how they did that. Like, how did they manage to overshadow
Yeah.
the traditional, religious establishment? And what does that even mean for Iran? And more importantly, what does that mean for the Middle East and, and for us?
Yeah, and I got to say, like, going through the stuff you sent me, one thing that really jumped out at me was just how in the early days, like the mullah regime was almost seen as, a protege by some Western powers. Like there was this, reported early collaboration between Ayatollah Khomeini and the CIA.
Huh.
There were even rumors of like a kill list targeting Communist Party members,
Wow.
which, it's wild to think about that now, given how fiercely anti-Western,
Yeah, absolutely.
the current regime is.
I mean, that's just such a stark contrast to how things are today. It really is unsettling when you think about how these, geopolitical alliances can shift like the sand.
It really is. But let's get back to the main topic here, the IRGC.
Right.
So, initially they were formed in 1979 under Khomeini.
Yeah.
And really their core purpose was to enforce his vision of wilayat al-faqih.
Yeah.
Which is this whole concept of a global, guardianship-based political system for Muslims.
During the occultation.
During the occultation of the imam.
Yeah.
So they were basically like the muscle.
Yeah, the enforcers.
Yeah, the enforcers of this ideology.
Yeah, so wilayat al-faqih was the ideology, and the IRGC was like the vehicle.
The vehicle, exactly.
To make it happen.
Yeah.
And the scale of their early involvement in backing these Shia militant groups across the Middle East is
it's incredible.
Massive.
Yeah, there's an Al-Hayat report from 2015 that talks about how they formed and trained over 42 brigades.
What?
138 battalions.
Wow.
And supported over 100 Shia militant groups in Iraq and Syria.
That's insane.
It's huge in such a short period of time.
Yeah, that's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And these weren't just like theoretical groups either.
Yeah.
Like your sources actually give some very specific examples of these groups so we can kind of get a sense of their reach.
It makes it very real.
Yeah. You see names like Asaib al-Haq.
Right.
Which is Gangs of the People of the Truth.
Oh, wow.
Kataib Hezbollah, which is Hezbollah battalions, and then the Badr organization. And the Badr organization is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because they've been around for such a long time.
Yeah.
They go all the way back to the Iran-Iraq War.
Right.
And they actually played a pretty big role in the fight against ISIS.
Oh, wow.
More recently, which is really fascinating.
Wow.
And it's also interesting to note that former Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki, he had close ties to this group.
Oh, wow. So these are some serious players here.
Oh, absolutely. They were really reshaping power dynamics in the region.
Yeah, and then you have the Quds Force.
Right.
Which is like their elite special operations.
Special forces, yeah.
And they played a crucial role in keeping the Assad regime in power in Syria.
Yeah.
And they even oversaw the formation of groups like the Liwa Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas Brigade.
Right.
Which was, ostensibly to protect Shia holy sites there.
Yeah, it's very interesting how they were able to, position themselves as the protector of these sites.
Yeah, so, initially their focus was very much on exporting the revolution and, building up this network of Shia groups.
Yeah.
But as your sources make clear, their ambitions and their power base grew way beyond that.
It went way beyond the initial plan.
Yeah, like they really accumulated a breathtaking amount of economic power.
Breathtaking is right.
I mean, we're talking about the IRGC controlling something like 20 to 40% of Iran's entire economy.
It's a huge amount.
They account for over 1/6 of its GDP.
Wow.
And they're generating annual profits somewhere around $15 billion.
That's not just a little side hustle.
No, it's not. It's not just a market share that's like a dominant position.
Right.
Across so many key sectors. We're talking about pharmaceuticals, pipelines.
Everything.
construction, oil and gas, finance, banking, even telecommunications.
It really is. It's like they've built this whole shadow economy.
Yeah, it's almost like a state within a state.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And your sources even compare it to the Chinese People's Liberation Army and their business interests. It's that kind of scale.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting is like, why are they doing this?
Right. Like, what's the point of all this wealth?
Yeah. What's the purpose?
Your materials highlight 3 main reasons.
Okay.
So the first one, and probably the most obvious one, is to fund all of their military activities.
Right. So all the stuff with the nuclear program and the missiles.
Yeah, all the controversial stuff and all the support for these militant groups.
Which, some people would call straight up terrorism.
It depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
But they're definitely funding a lot of activities with this money.
Yeah. So basically, their economic might is what allows them to pursue this military agenda.
Exactly. It all goes hand in hand.
Okay, so that's the first reason. What are the other big goals?
So the second reason is that, having all these companies and businesses allows them to get around all those international sanctions that are in place, and it helps them to buy weapons and technology.
It's like a way to operate under the radar.
It's like a back door, right?
Yeah.
It's a way to be discreet.
Yeah, that's really clever.
Yeah. And then the third reason, and this one's really important, is that all this money, it generates a lot of wealth for the people in charge of the IRGC.
So they're not exactly struggling.
No, not at all. And that wealth turns into political power.
Right. So it's like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly. The more money they have, the more power they have, and then they can use that power to make even more money.
It's kind of scary when you think about it like that.
It can be. Yeah. And don't forget, they also control Iran's borders.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
The airspace, the seaports, the airports.
So they control everything that comes in and out.
They have a lot of leverage over trade and the movement of goods and people.
Right. And on top of all that, they're the ones running the nuclear program and the ballistic missile program.
Right.
And the Quads force is handling all the, the shady stuff abroad.
All the unconventional warfare and intelligence.
Yeah. So they're really involved in everything.
They really are.
Now, during Khomeini's lifetime, the IRGC was powerful.
Yeah.
But they pretty much stayed within the boundaries of his authority.
Right. He was the supreme leader.
Yeah. But then when he died, and Khamenei took over, he didn't really have that same level of, unchallenged charisma.
He wasn't as intimidating, let's be honest.
Yeah. And that created an opportunity for the IRGC.
Yeah, they saw an opening.
To start expanding their influence.
Absolutely. And they took it.
And according to what I've read, that expansion really accelerated during Ahmadinejad's presidency.
Which makes sense because he was a former IRGC officer himself.
Exactly. So he was one of their own.
One of their guys, yeah.
And it seems like that's when the lines between the executive branch and the military really started to blur.
It all became very murky.
Yeah, with all these state contracts going to IRGC-affiliated companies.
Right. And they always justified it by saying it was for national security.
Of course. So basically there was no real separation of power anymore.
Not really, no.
But then Rouhani gets elected in 2013.
Right.
And he was seen as more of a pragmatic figure.
Yeah, he wanted to make some changes.
Yeah, he actually presented a challenge to this IRGC dominance.
Right, because his whole agenda was about reform.
Yeah, he wanted more economic transparency. He wanted to dismantle monopolies.
Which was a direct threat to the IRGC's interests.
Oh, yeah, they were not happy about that.
Not at all. And then on top of that, he was the one pushing for the JCPOA.
Yeah, the Iran nuclear deal.
And the hardliners in the IRGC hated that.
They did not want to make a deal.
No, they saw it as a weakness.
So how did they respond to all this?
Well, they responded forcefully. They cracked down.
In what way?
They started arresting dual nationals, journalists, businessmen.
Oh, wow.
On all these trumped-up charges like espionage.
So basically, they created a climate of fear.
That was the goal, yeah, to shut down any opposition.
And to undermine Rouhani's reforms.
And it worked.
It did. And it's interesting how U.S. policy, played a role in all this, too. Like we talked about earlier, how the mullahs were initially kind of favored by the West.
Yeah, it's crazy how things change.
But then you have Obama and Kerry working to get this nuclear deal with Rouhani and Zarif.
Yeah.
Even though the IRGC was totally against it.
They were furious.
Yeah, they were not happy.
But the Obama administration felt like the JCPOA was the best way to stop Iran from getting nukes.
And to open up some kind of dialogue.
Right.
But then Trump comes in.
Yeah.
And he listens to Netanyahu.
Right.
And he pulls the U.S. out of the deal.
Which really messed things up.
Yeah. And your sources argued that move
Yeah.
not only damaged America's credibility,
which it totally did,
but it also strengthened the IRGC.
Yeah, because it gave them ammunition to discredit the moderates in Iran.
Oh, I see. Like they could say, see, we told you we can't trust the West.
Exactly.
And then you have the assassination of Soleimani in 2020.
Right.
Which seems like it was a major turning point.
Yeah, that was huge.
It pushed the IRGC even further toward this hardline stance.
Yeah.
And it basically cemented their alliance with China and Russia.
And you know what's interesting is that even Trump later said that he regretted that operation.
Really?
Yeah, he felt like he was misled by Israel.
Wow. So basically, killing Soleimani was a huge escalation.
It really was.
And it had all these unintended consequences.
It backfired big time.
Yeah, it totally did.
And you can see the consequences playing out today.
Yeah, like with that 25-year deal they signed with China in 2021.
Right, a $400 billion deal.
It's massive.
It covers energy infrastructure security.
And then them supplying weapons to Russia in Ukraine.
It's clear they've chosen their side.
They have, and so now we're in this situation where the IRGC has all this economic and political power.
Right.
They basically sidelined the religious establishment.
Yeah.
And they've made these new powerful friends.
And now with Khamenei being so sick.
Yeah, everyone's talking about his successor.
Right.
And it seems like the IRGC is poised to take over completely.
It's a real possibility. Yeah.
And I mean, just think about it.
Yeah.
A military dictatorship in Iran.
A very scary thought.
Yeah, a country with tons of resources.
Yeah.
A strategic location.
In a very volatile region.
And they hate us.
Yeah.
And Israel.
It's not a good combination.
It's not good at all. Yeah. But let's dig a little deeper into this whole economic coup that the IRGC has pulled off. Like your sources go into a lot of detail about how they managed to gain control over all these resources.
Right.
Often without the mullahs even knowing.
It was very sneaky.
Yeah, it wasn't like a sudden takeover.
No, it was very gradual.
It was a process that really started after Khomeini died.
Right, because Khamenei was more reliant on them.
He needed their muscle.
Exactly.
So how did they do it?
Well, they were very opportunistic.
Yeah.
They took advantage of every situation.
Like what kind of situations?
Well, you know, after the Iran-Iraq war,
right,
the country was devastated.
Yeah, they needed to rebuild everything.
Exactly, and the IRGC stepped in.
And they got all the contracts.
They got all the big contracts, for reconstruction.
And they used national security as an excuse.
That's right. So they could bypass all the normal procedures.
And they didn't have to compete with anyone?
No, they basically had a monopoly.
So while the mullahs were controlling the economy through these boneyards...
Yeah, these charitable foundations.
Yeah, the IRGC found another way to get the money.
They created their own system.
And then in the 2000s, they started privatizing a lot of state-owned companies.
Right.
Which was supposed to open up the economy.
Yeah, in theory.
But the IRGC just swooped in.
And bought up everything.
Yeah, they bought up huge stakes in telecom manufacturing shipping.
Through all these shady deals.
Where there was no oversight from the mullahs.
Exactly. They were operating in the shadows.
Yeah, and a good example of that is how they acquired the mobile telecommunication company of Iran.
That was a big one.
So they basically took advantage of privatization.
They exploited it to their advantage.
And then when Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, and all those sanctions came back.
That really helped them too.
It did, because it crippled the official economy.
Right.
But the IRGC, they already had this whole shadow economy in place.
You were ready for it.
Yeah, they were smuggling oil, petrochemicals, all kinds of stuff.
Through all these ports that they controlled?
Like Bandar Abbas and Chabahar.
Exactly.
So they were making a killing while everyone else was suffering.
And they were getting even richer.
And they've also basically taken over the defense industry.
Right.
They're producing drones, missiles, all kinds of weapons.
You're becoming self-sufficient.
Yeah, and they're even exporting some of this stuff.
They're making a lot of money from it.
Yeah, and they're planning to sell even more to countries like Russia.
It's a big business.
So basically, the IRGC has all the real power in Iran.
They have the money, they have the resources, they have the guns.
And the mullahs only have their religious authority.
Which doesn't mean much in the real world.
Not anymore. And your sources also talk about how the IRGC is taking over land and resources.
Oh, yeah.
In key provinces like Khuzestan.
Which is where all the oil is.
Yeah, and Sistan Baluchistan.
On the border with Afghanistan and Pakistan.
They're basically pushing the mullahs out.
They're taking everything for themselves.
So they've got the economic power.
Yeah.
But how have they turned that into political control?
Well, they've been very smart about it.
In what way?
They've been placing their people
Oh, I see.
in key positions throughout the government.
Like where?
In the parliament, in the judiciary, in the provincial governorships.
So they're infiltrating the system.
They're taking over from the inside.
And now they're even getting their guys elected president.
Like Raisi.
Yeah, and they're already talking about his successor.
Who will probably be another IRGC guy.
So the mullahs are being pushed aside.
They're becoming figureheads.
Yeah, they're losing their grip on power.
They can't really do anything about it.
And if anyone tries to speak out against them,
the IRGC will crush them.
Yeah, they've got the Basij,
the paramilitary force,
and the intelligence service.
They're everywhere.
And they're really good at propaganda, too.
Oh, yeah, they know how to spin things.
They're using this revolutionary rhetoric.
Right.
They're appealing to nationalism.
To patriotism.
They're playing up the anti-Western sentiment.
Yeah.
And it's working.
It's very effective.
Yeah, it is. And all this power and money.
Yeah.
It's allowing them to fund all these proxy wars across the Middle East.
They're pulling the strings.
Yeah, and they're making so much money from oil smuggling.
Like billions of dollars a year.
That goes straight to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis.
It's a huge network.
And they're using profits from telecom and construction to fund weapons production and train militias in Iraq.
They're a well-oiled machine.
They are. And the craziest part is
How's that?
They don't even need the government's approval to do any of this.
They're completely independent.
Yeah, they're calling the shots.
They're in control.
So the big takeaway here is,
well, it's pretty clear that the IRGC has completely changed Iran.
They've taken over.
They're the ones in charge now.
And that has huge implications for everyone.
For the people in Iran, for the region, for the world.
Yeah, it's a very unstable situation.
And it's only going to get more complicated.
So for our listeners out there, think about this.
Yeah.
How is all this going to play out?
Right.
How will the IRGC's power grab affect global events?
Especially with a new supreme leader coming soon.
Yeah, it's a question we all need to be thinking about.
That's a big one.
Because the stakes are very high.
They are.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
We'll see you next time. Ever feel like you just want to cut through the noise and get right to the heart of a global situation? Well, we're aiming to do that today. You've probably heard bits and pieces about Iran's evolving ties with some pretty powerful players on the world stage.
Yeah, you're talking about Russia, China, and North Korea. We're zeroing in on the growing cooperation between Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC for short, and those three countries.
This deep dive is all about giving you a clear picture of this complex but really significant shift in global affairs.
We've gone through a lot of information to bring you the most important aspects of this collaboration. The idea is to give you that shortcut to understanding the dynamics, the motives, even some surprising connections, all without getting bogged down.
Right, so let's break it down, starting with the IRGC itself. I mean, one thing that jumps out is just how much influence they wield inside Iran. They've really become this dominant force.
It is fascinating to see how the IRGC has risen to this position where they are increasingly overshadowing, you could even say eclipsing, Iran's traditional religious leaders.
Really sidelining the mullahs.
In a way, yes. What our sources show is that the IRGC is now the main player when it comes to both the economy and the military.
You know, it's interesting. One source used the phrase economic gatekeepers to describe the IRGC. What does that look like in practice?
Well, think about it this way. When Russia wants to buy drones from Iran or China wants to import large quantities of oil, those transactions are being handled by IRGC-affiliated companies.
So they're cutting out the traditional middlemen.
Exactly. They've basically bypassed those clerical intermediaries, and that's a sign of their economic power. These partnerships bring in billions of dollars that flow into sectors controlled by the IRGC.
So energy, construction, manufacturing?
Yeah, it's a wide range, which really shows how deeply embedded they are in Iran's economy. Their influence goes way beyond just the military.
Okay, so let's dive into the specifics of these partnerships. First, Russia. It seems like things have really ramped up between them and the IRGC, especially since 2022.
Oh, absolutely. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was a turning point. It seems to have pushed the IRGC into this role of a crucial military supplier for Russia.
We're talking about those Shahed 136 drones we keep hearing about in the Ukraine conflict.
Thousands of them, supplied by companies under IRGC control.
And it's not just drones either. Our information points to ballistic missiles also being transferred to Russia.
Right. Starting sometime in early 2024, there's been a notable transfer of Fate 110 ballistic missiles. These have a range of, well, it depends on the specific type, but roughly between 186 and 435 miles.
So that's a lot of firepower that Iran is providing. But what's Russia giving in return? It can't all be one-sided.
That's a good point. There's definitely a quid pro quo here. In exchange for Iran's support, Russia is providing them with some pretty advanced military tech.
Like what specifically?
Well, we're talking Su-35 fighter jets, attack helicopters, sophisticated radar systems. This is a major upgrade for Iran's Air Force, which has been struggling because of, years of sanctions.
So the IRGC is using this partnership to not just get funding, but to really modernize their military.
Exactly. And then there's that joint drone factory they set up in Russia.
Right, in the Tatarstan region.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty serious commitment to this cooperation.
It is. It's been operational since last year, and the goal is to have it churning out a huge number of those Shahed drones. I mean, we're talking potentially 6,000 per year by 2025.
So it's not just about helping Russia in the short term, it's about building a long-term production capacity.
And for the IRGC, it's also about getting that valuable battlefield data, seeing how their drones perform in a real conflict. Plus, having production outside Iran makes them less vulnerable to sanctions.
It's a win-win, at least for them. Russia gets relatively cheap but effective weapons. Iran gets the testing ground and the production capability.
Precisely.
Our sources also talk about the Quds Force, the IRGC's elite unit, and their coordination with Russian forces in Syria. What's the story there?
Yeah, so the Quds Force has been working with the Russians in Syria for some time now, supporting the Assad regime against various opposition groups, sharing intelligence, providing logistical support, that kind of thing.
A lot of shared interests there, fighting against some of the same adversaries.
Right. But there's been a recent development that's really shaken things up. According to our sources, Bashar al-Assad has been ousted by Turkish-backed rebels.
Ugh. Wow. So even with Russia as an ally, things aren't going perfectly for Iran in the region.
No, not at all. This ouster is a significant setback for Iranian ambitions in the region. It weakens their network of proxy forces there, shows the complexity of these alliances. You can have support from Russia, but events on the ground can still really throw a wrench in your plans.
For sure. So beyond direct military support, it seems like the IRGC is also gaining a lot economically from this relationship with Russia.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to dealing with those sanctions.
Absolutely. The sanctions are a huge factor here. The IRGC has these oil smuggling networks, which bring in a lot of money for them.
And Russia is happy to play ball.
Yeah, they're willing to do oil swaps and barter deals, which helps Iran get around those restrictions. They've even set up a system for direct bank transfers between Iranian and Russian banks using rubles and reals.
So they're bypassing the SWIFT system, which most international banks use.
Exactly. Makes it much harder to track their financial activities. And of course, you have the bigger picture of strategic alignment.
Both countries seeing the U.S. as the main adversary.
Right. And they formalize that with a strategic partnership treaty signed in January 2025. The treaty emphasizes joint military exercises, cooperation against external threats, although it's worth noting that there's no mutual defense clause.
Meaning they're not obligated to come to each other's aid if one of them is attacked.
Yeah. Still, this alignment with Russia clearly emboldens the IRGC, allows them to operate more freely in the region, and continue supporting groups like Hezbollah.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about China. Our sources describe China as an economic lifeline for the IRGC. That sounds pretty crucial.
It is. China is by far the most important economic partner for the IRGC. They're Iran's biggest oil customer. And a lot of that oil is being bought at a discount because of the sanctions.
Right, so the IRGC is selling oil to China below market price.
Exactly, and this is all happening under that 25-year cooperation agreement they signed back in 2021.
We're talking billions of dollars going directly to the IRGC through these oil sales.
Yes, significant sums. Plus, you have Chinese companies investing in other sectors of the Iranian economy.
Like energy projects.
Yeah, you have Chinese firms partnering with companies linked to the IRGC, like Qatam Alumbia, to work on major energy projects. One example is the South Pars gas field, a massive natural gas field.
So it's not just buying oil, it's direct investment in Iran's infrastructure.
Right, and it's not just energy either. There are Chinese investments in telecommunications, infrastructure projects like the Taran Metro. All of this generates revenue that flows to the IRGC.
Okay, but what about military support from China? Our sources suggest it's a bit more subtle than what we see with Russia.
That's true. China is a lot more cautious, especially when it comes to anything that could be seen as directly arming Iran. They don't want to jeopardize their global economic interests. But They are believed to be providing what are called dual-use technologies.
Meaning things that can be used for both civilian and military purposes.
Exactly. This includes things like components for ballistic missiles and drones, things like microelectronics and guidance systems.
So these are key parts that Iran needs to build up its military capabilities.
Right, and often these components are routed through third countries to make it harder to track where they're coming from and avoid those sanctions.
So China is providing support, but they prefer to keep it under the radar.
Exactly. They want plausible deniability. This less direct support still has a big impact, though. It helps the IRGC arm its proxies in the region.
Groups like the Houthis in Yemen, who have been using these advanced weapons to attack targets in the Red Sea.
Right. It's a way for China to exert influence without getting directly involved in the fighting.
So the China-Iran relationship seems to be driven more by pragmatism, economic necessity, rather than some deep ideological bond.
I think that's a fair assessment. China sees Iran as a way to counter U.S. influence in the Middle East. And Iran is a reliable supplier of oil, which is crucial for China's economy. Plus, the IRGC benefits from having China as a powerful friend in the UN Security Council, where they can use their veto power to protect Iran.
It's a convenient partnership.
Very much so. Although there are some tensions, of course. China puts a lot of emphasis on stability, and sometimes the IRGC's actions, like their support for Hezbollah, can be seen as destabilizing.
So China might not always be happy with everything the IRGC does.
Right. They might prefer a more cautious approach in some cases.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to the last player in this network, North Korea. This is a relationship that goes way back, according to our sources.
It does. The cooperation between Iran and North Korea dates back to the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War. Back then, North Korea was a key supplier of ballistic missile technology to Iran.
So they've been in this game for a while.
Oh, yeah. And today, it's become this really robust exchange of military know-how. The IRGC has adopted North Korean designs for their missiles, like the Fateh and Kwaibar-Shekan.
Taking those designs and building on them.
Exactly. And in return, Iran is sharing its expertise, particularly in drone technology. There's even some speculation that they might be sharing knowledge related to chemical weapons.
Whoa.
Yeah, it gets pretty deep. They're also sharing knowledge about tunneling techniques, which North Korea is known for. Iran can use this to protect their sensitive military and nuclear sites, making them much harder to target.
So it's a mutually beneficial exchange of really sensitive military tech.
Absolutely, and it doesn't stop there. According to our sources, there's evidence that the IRGC might have played a role, albeit indirectly, in North Korea's recent arms transfers to Russia.
So after Russia invaded Ukraine, they started getting weapons from North Korea.
Yeah, and there's reason to believe that some of the North Korean munitions being used in Ukraine contain Iranian components. So it's this three-way cooperation that's really expanding the IRGC's reach and influence.
It all gets very tangled.
For sure. It's a complex web. And the North Korean arsenal, potentially upgraded with Russian technology, can then feed back into Iran's own military development. It's a loop.
A very dangerous loop.
And
much like with Russia, there's also an economic aspect to the IRGC's ties with North Korea, right? Especially when it comes to getting around those pesky sanctions.
Absolutely. They share smuggling routes, money laundering tactics. The IRGC's oil trade intersects with North Korea's illicit activities, often going through ports in China. It's this whole clandestine economic network that allows both regimes to survive under international pressure, and their cooperation seems to be expanding beyond just trade.
Oh, in what way?
Well, there are reports that the IRGC is training North Korean operatives in cyber warfare.
So they're not just trading goods, they're sharing skills and knowledge.
Exactly. And at the core of it all is that shared view of the U.S. as the main adversary. That's a powerful unifying factor. It's not a formal alliance in the traditional sense, but it's a partnership built on a shared need for survival, a shared defiance of the international community. And you see this reflected in the IRGC's support for North Korea's provocations, like missile tests and things like that.
Okay, so we've covered these three strands of cooperation. But our sources also point out that these relationships aren't without their limits. It's not like some unified, monolithic block, right?
No, not at all. Each of these relationships is bilateral, meaning it's between two countries, and it's driven by their own specific interests, which are often quite pragmatic. There's no sign of any formal three-way coordination between Russia, China, and North Korea when it comes to their dealings with Iran, and their approaches can differ significantly.
Oh, so?
Well, China tends to be more cautious, more focused on the global picture. They don't want to rock the boat too much. Russia and North Korea, on the other hand, are more willing to take risks, to be aggressive, especially in their own regions.
And that can create friction.
It can. There was a report, for example, that China wasn't happy about North Korea potentially sending troops to help Russia in Ukraine. That's the kind of thing that makes Beijing nervous.
Interesting. So the IRGC is essentially playing these relationships to its advantage, picking and choosing what it needs from each partner.
Exactly. They're leveraging these relationships to fund their activities, to arm their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, various Iraqi militias. All of this contributes to instability in the region, fuels those proxy conflicts.
And it's not without risks for the IRGC either, right? I mean, they're becoming increasingly reliant on these partners who might not always be reliable themselves.
That's a valid point. Russia's economy is not in great shape. China might be hesitant to fully support the IRGC's agenda, especially if things get too messy. And North Korea is, well, North Korea, they're very isolated.
Not exactly the most stable of partners.
Yeah.
And then there are the internal pressures within Iran itself.
Yeah, the economic situation is causing a lot of hardship for ordinary Iranians. That's creating discontent, which could eventually pose a threat to the regime's stability.
So lots of moving parts here, lots of potential for things to go wrong.
Definitely. It's a complex and evolving situation.
Okay, so let's step back and consider the big picture. What's the overall significance of all this cooperation? How is it changing the balance of power in the region and beyond?
When you look at it from a broader perspective, this network that the IRGC has built up is significantly boosting their military capabilities. It's helping them weather those economic sanctions, and it's expanding their influence across the Middle East. Each partner plays a unique role.
Russia providing the battlefield experience, the advanced weaponry, China being the economic lifeline, providing key technology, and North Korea sharing their expertise on missiles and all those illicit trade networks.
Precisely. And this allows the IRGC to defy the West, to continue supporting those proxy wars, to essentially become this major disruptor in the region.
And the thorn in the side of the U.S. and its allies.
For sure. Now, they're not a unified bloc, as we've discussed. They have their own priorities, their own tensions. But this dynamic poses a real challenge to U.S. interests in the Middle East.
And then there's the impact on Iran itself. I mean, the IRGC's rise has really reshaped the country's political landscape.
Yeah, it's been a dramatic shift. They've sidelined the traditional religious establishment, essentially turning Iran into this more militarized state where economic control equals political power.
So the mullahs are losing their grip.
In a way, yes. They've been relegated to a more ceremonial role. And this has implications for Iran's foreign policy. The IRGC's ideology, their worldview, is driving Iran away from that historical stance of neutrality, pushing them closer to Russia and China, widening the gap with the West.
Creating this new axis of power.
Exactly. And this alignment with Russia and China, with the IRGC at the helm, is a major cause for concern for both the U.S. and Israel. They see it as a threat to their regional interests, and really rightfully so. It's a development they're watching very closely.
Okay, so to sum it all up for our listeners, the key takeaway here is that the IRGC's strategic cooperation with Russia, China, and North Korea is a really significant event, one that has far-reaching implications for the balance of power, both regionally and globally.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this is a complex network of relationships, with each partner bringing their own motivations and contributions to the table.
It's a mix of shared interests, but also potential for conflict and instability. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. As the IRGC becomes even more dominant within Iran, pushing aside the traditional religious establishment, how might this internal power shift further shape Iran's alliances with Russia, China, and North Korea? And what unforeseen consequences could arise from this evolving power dynamic in the Middle East? It's something to think about. What happens when military power trumps religious authority in shaping a nation's foreign policy? What does that mean for the future of the region?
A very good question indeed. One that we'll all be grappling with for some time to come.
Absolutely.
Man, the Middle East, you look at it today and it feels like there's always this underlying tension, between Israel and Iran. And so much of it seems to come back to this one group, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating right now, I think, is how Israel's approach has shifted over the past, year and a half even. It's not just about reacting to immediate threats anymore.
No.
It's become way more about proactively targeting not just the usual, proxy groups, but the IRGC themselves more and more. It's a really big change.
It is. And if you're like most people, you probably want to get a grip on all of this without needing a PhD in Middle East politics, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Yeah. We've been diving deep into a bunch of sources trying to understand exactly how these Israeli military actions from, October 2023 all the way up to now March 2025 are hitting the IRGC and, Iran's entire game plan in the region. So basically what we're after this deep dive is to figure out how Israel's actions have messed with the IRGC, like their military strength, how effective their network of groups is, the whole web they've got, plus the pressure inside Iran and the bigger geopolitical picture. All without getting too bogged down in the weeds.
Right. No 10-page reports here.
Exactly.
Okay, so it seems like after that initial Hamas attack, things really changed.
Definitely. I mean, the immediate reaction after October 7th, 2023 was obviously defensive, right? Okay. Makes sense. But from around March 2024 on through to now, March 2025, there's this clear move towards a more, aggressive strategy, directly hitting IRGC assets, not just going after the proxy groups.
And we're not talking small-scale stuff here. These were some serious operations.
Oh, absolutely. Some really key ones stick out. Like, think about the airstrikes in Syria, especially the one in April 2024 where they took out Mohammad Reza Zahedi, a top IRGC commander.
Yeah.
That sent a massive message.
For sure. And then there were those stepped-up strikes against Hezbollah.
Right. And from what we're seeing, it looks like those culminated in the assassination of their leader, Hassan Nasrallah, back in September 2024. And they got Abbas Nilfourishan at the same time.
Taking out leaders like that, that has to have a huge impact.
It absolutely does. And, we can't forget the big picture here. These weren't just random hits. The sources also point to those unprecedented strikes inside Iran itself back in October 2024, directly hitting those IRGC missile sites. They said it was retaliation for the Iranian ballistic missile attacks.
Wow. Hitting Iranian soil directly, that's a big escalation. You have to think it really threw a wrench in their whole regional power play.
Yeah, it definitely messed with their ability to flex their muscles the way they used to.
So let's break down how this has actually hit the IRGC themselves. Losing those top guys is going to be a serious blow.
No doubt about it. Losing guys like Zahedi and Nilfourishan, especially in the Quads Force. Think of the Quads Force as like the IRGC's Special Ops and Foreign Policy Wing, all in one, pushing their influence outside of Iran. Losing these guys. Huge. It's not just about the tactics. It hurts their image, their whole reputation. Huh. They've worked hard to make themselves seem untouchable. And this definitely cracks that image.
And then those strikes inside Iran in October, I can only imagine what the reaction was like inside the country.
What's interesting there is how those strikes were carried out, targeting the missile production and storage. It showed that Israel can get through their air defenses. Now, of course, Iranian media downplayed the damage.
Sure.
But internally, it must have raised some serious questions about the IRGC's whole job protecting Iran.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so Syria. It's been this key battleground for a while now. How have all these operations changed the IRGC's presence and influence there?
Oh, Syria is super important for Iran's whole regional strategy. It's a crucial area. And our sources say they've been taking a lot of hits there from those Israeli airstrikes going back to late 2023. It got so bad that Tehran had to change how they operate.
So what kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, by early 2024, they'd pulled back a lot of their high-ranking IRGC guys from Syria. Why? Because they were losing too many, and there were these growing worries about intelligence leaks that were basically giving Israel targets.
So if they're pulling back, who's filling the gap?
And all of this is where those proxy groups get even more important. But it also makes things messier for Iran. They're leaning more on groups like Hezbollah and local Syrian Shiite militias. It lets them keep doing stuff, but they lose that direct control. These proxies have their own agendas, right? They might not always do exactly what Tehran wants.
And it sounds like things in Syria itself have gone through some major upheaval.
Oh, yeah. If you look at the bigger picture, the sources talk about this huge development. Assad reportedly being kicked out, Russia pulling out, and Turkish-backed groups supposedly taking over in Damascus. If that's true, it's a massive blow to Iran's influence and the IRGC's power in Syria.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack. Okay, let's talk about this axis of resistance thing. It feels like all of this has really put it to the test.
For sure. Iran's whole strategy for years has been to build up this network of proxy forces.
Yeah.
Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. It's like a buffer zone around Israel, meant to deter anyone from messing with them. But these Israeli operations over the past year they've really exposed some weaknesses in that whole strategy.
Let's talk about some specific groups. Hezbollah, for example. People often see them as Iran's strongest ally in the region. What kind of setbacks have they had?
Our sources call them catastrophic. Those Israeli intelligence ops, like they reportedly messed up Hezbollah's communications back in September 2024, and then, of course, the supposed assassination of Nasrallah. That wrecked their leadership structure and their ability to operate effectively.
I mean, hitting their comms, that's a nightmare for any group.
Absolutely. And it didn't stop there. By late 2024, a huge chunk of Hezbollah's weapon stockpiles were gone, reportedly destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. They can't do much offensively now. And for the IRGC, who poured tons of resources into turning Hezbollah into this powerful force,
right,
it's a huge strategic loss.
What about Hamas? They've been through an intense, prolonged conflict, to say the least.
Definitely. Israel's offensive in Gaza, which went on for a year, wrecked a lot of Hamas's infrastructure and caused a ton of casualties. The sources actually mentioned figures from local health officials in Gaza saying thousands of Palestinians were killed. The IRGC has always backed Hamas with money and weapons, but they couldn't shield them from this. It shows the limits of that support and might even hurt Iran's reputation among other Palestinian groups.
Interesting. And then there's the Houthis in Yemen. They seem to be playing their own game a bit more.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even with the U.S. and sometimes Israel hitting them, they're still pretty resilient. They keep messing with Red Sea shipping and have even shot missiles at Israel, a lot of times using tech from the IRGC.
But they're not as directly involved in the Israel-Iran thing, right?
Exactly. They're far away from Israel, and they mainly focus on maritime stuff. So, yeah, they give Iran another way to cause trouble, but it doesn't really make up for the losses elsewhere.
So all these setbacks for the IRGC and their proxy groups, there have to be ripples inside Iran, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
All these problems they're facing abroad are probably making things worse inside Iran.
Yeah.
The economy's already struggling with the sanctions, and now the IRGC's side hustles, the oil smuggling and such, are probably getting squeezed even harder because of all the regional fighting.
And that could lead to more public unrest.
For sure, it's a possibility. There's already been a lot of simmering anger, especially since those big protests back in 2022. If the IRGC is seen as dragging Iran into this long, expensive conflict and it's not even going well, that anger could boil over.
Still, the IRGC holds a lot of political power in Iran.
Oh, totally. They're deeply embedded in the government. Lots of former IRGC guys are in key positions, and they'll definitely have a big say in who replaces Khamenei eventually. But these setbacks, they've probably sparked some arguments among the leadership. You've got the hardliners who want a big, strong response to scare everyone off, and then the more level-headed folks who worry about triggering a U.S. intervention or making things worse internationally.
And then there's Raisi's death. Doesn't that throw another wrench into things?
It really does. He was tight with the IRGC,
yeah,
which definitely helped them back home. But his passing adds this layer of uncertainty at a really bad time.
Definitely. Okay, let's talk nukes. Our sources mention those long-standing worries about the JCPOA and Iran's ballistic missiles.
Right. The Trump administration and Netanyahu, they were always concerned about the JCPOA expiring and, Iran just being able to do whatever they want with missiles, which, let's be honest, could carry nukes. The sources even mentioned this book, The New Global Order, from way back in 2016 that apparently talked about all of this.
Right. And so where do Iran's main nuclear facilities fit into all of this?
The big ones are places like Natanz, that's their main enrichment facility, Fordow, the one buried underground, Isfahan, where they convert uranium, and Iraq, the heavy water reactor. Then there's Taligan, too, at Parchin. That one's been linked to weapons research in the past. It supposedly got hit in those Israeli strikes in October 2024, but it sounds like they're up and running again.
So even with the setbacks and all the international pressure, it sounds like Iran's program is moving forward.
It definitely seems like it. They've made progress with their centrifuges and those underground facilities. They're built to withstand a lot. They're clearly determined to keep developing this thing.
And then there's this reported letter from Trump to Khamenei back in March. Seems like a pretty big diplomatic move.
Oh, for sure. Sky News Arabia reported on this. Apparently, the letter offered Iran a way out of all this mess, a way to improve things. It talked about lifting sanctions, helping their economy, starting to cooperate again. But it also had a warning. If they escalate or keep backing groups the U.S. considers terrorists, the response will be swift and harsh. So it's the classic carrot and stick approach.
So what did Iran do?
They went through Oman, which is interesting because Oman's been the go-between for Iran and the West for a while now, like during the JCPOA talks. It seems like they're at least open to talking.
And it sounds like the U.S. is also talking to other big players.
They are. There's talk about the U.S. asking Russia to try and get Iran to calm down and avoid a bigger fight. It just goes to show how tangled up all these relationships are.
And yet we still see military stuff happening.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. has those B-2 bombers at Diego Garcia, and they keep hitting the Houthis in Yemen to protect those Red Sea shipping routes. So even with diplomacy maybe happening, the military stuff continues.
Yeah. With all the tension and Iran's nuclear program moving along, those potential strikes by Israel or the U.S., they have to be on the table, right?
They have to be. The goal would be to cripple their uranium enrichment and stop them from getting nukes, or at least slow them down.
So what are we looking at militarily on both sides?
Israel has a strong air force with those F-35s and bunker busters like the GBU-28, but going after those really deep, hardened sites like Fordo, they'd probably need the U.S. to do any real damage. The U.S., though, they have even bigger bunker busters like the MOP and those B-2 bombers that can fly super far. They're better equipped for that.
And what would be the main targets?
Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan would be top of the list because of how important they are for enriching and converting uranium. And probably places like Parchin because of its history. Remember that attack in October 2024? That showed Israel can hit specific targets, but wiping out a whole nuclear program that's spread out is tough.
Okay, so realistically, how much could a successful strike set Iran back?
It's hard to say for sure, but maybe 1 to 4 years. But remember, Iran's getting better with their centrifuges and those underground facilities. They might be able to bounce back faster. A strike would take out infrastructure, people, and mess up their supply chains. And getting rid of any enriched uranium they have would be big, but there's always a chance they have more stashed away somewhere.
And we've seen Iran bounce back from this kind of thing before, haven't we?
Oh, for sure. Remember when Natanz got hit in 2020 and 2021? They rebuilt pretty quickly. And if they get hit again, who knows? Maybe they'll move even more stuff to secret sites, which would make it way harder for the IAEA to keep track of them.
Okay, so let's say their nuclear facilities get hit. How does Iran retaliate?
Oh, they'd hit back hard, and in lots of ways. You can bet on missile and drone attacks on Israel, like those reported ones back in April and October of 2024. Israel's got good air defenses, though, so who knows how many would get through. We'd also see their proxy groups stepping up big time. Hezbollah hitting northern Israel, the Houthis messing with the Red Sea even more, and those Iraqi militias going after U.S. bases. There are still thousands of U.S. troops there, in Iraq and Syria.
The sources even mention a pretty chilling warning from a top Iranian military guy.
Yeah, he basically told The Telegraph that if the U.S. attacks from any bases in the region, they'll hit back, no matter who's stationed there. Specifically mentioned British, American, and Turkish forces.
Wow, and they might even go after targets further away.
Iranian state media has specifically said Diego Garcia, that U.S.-British base, could be a target. They say their newer missiles, like the Khorramshahr ones, and their drones can reach that far. And then there's the Strait of Hormuz. They could try to close it off, which would mess with a huge chunk of global oil shipping and send prices through the roof. And in the worst-case scenario, they might just ditch the non-proliferation treaty and say, fine, we're building nukes.
Man, a conflict that big, the consequences would be huge, way beyond just Israel and Iran.
It would be massive. It could easily draw in Hezbollah, the Houthis, even make things even worse in Iraq. And imagine the backlash in those Sunni Gulf states like Saudi Arabia. They'd be accused of being in cahoots with Israel.
So how would Russia and China react to all of this?
They'd condemn it for sure. And they might actually help Iran even more. Russia's already getting drones and missiles from Iran, so maybe they'd give them better air defenses or even help them with their nuclear program. China buys a lot of oil from Iran, so they might buy even more and help them get around sanctions. And they could both veto any UN resolutions against Iran, making the U.S. and Israel look even more isolated.
And what about the economic fallout globally?
Oh, if Iranian oil exports get messed up and the Strait of Hormuz gets closed, oil prices could skyrocket. We're talking $150 a barrel, maybe even more. That would be a disaster for Western economies, especially with inflation already a problem. It could even ruin any economic recovery plans. Europe needs that Middle Eastern oil, so they'd be pushing for everyone to calm down. But China, they might see this as a chance to get even more involved in the Middle East.
It sounds like even if a strike works, the long-term consequences could be a total mess.
They could. It might slow Iran down, but it probably wouldn't stop them for good. And the risk of a bigger war, messing up U.S. alliances, making Russia and China stronger, and crashing oil markets, those are all serious things to consider. It could even push Iran to just go for it and build nukes as a way to protect themselves.
So the U.S. and Israel are in a really tough spot.
No doubt. Military action might seem like a quick fix, but it could have disastrous long-term effects. Diplomacy is always tricky, but it's still the best way to avoid making things worse. It's interesting that in those 2024 strikes, they seem to avoid hitting the no-nuclear sites. Maybe that shows they want to be careful. But with all the tension and Iran pushing forward, things are getting really shaky.
And our sources suggest there might be different viewpoints within the U.S. government itself.
Yes, some folks might think that strikes could not only wreck Iran's nuclear program, but also maybe lead to regime change without a full-blown invasion. But others think that having Iran be powerful but without nukes could actually be good for the U.S., to balance out those Gulf countries getting cozy with China and to keep Turkey in check. And Israel will still be a key player.
So zooming out a bit, how have all these Israeli operations changed the balance of power in the region?
Overall, it seems like they've weakened Iran compared to some of its rivals. The U.S. is still firmly behind Israel, sharing intel and helping with air defenses. And some Gulf states, like Saudi Arabia, are quietly on board too. They might criticize Israel publicly, but they're worried about those Iranian missiles and all the trouble Iran causes, so they're cooperating behind the scenes.
And Iran's whole deterrent strategy isn't working as well as it used to.
It's not. The IRGC used to brag about their missiles, but they're not as scary against Israel's defenses, which are getting better all the time, thanks to the U.S. and others. But the biggest wild card is still Iran's nuclear program. It could change everything, and it makes the stakes incredibly high for everyone involved. Hopefully, like many sources say, diplomacy can still work, because the other option, well, it could be devastating.
So after this deep dive, it's clear that Israel's been busy, and it's had a real impact on the IRGC, those proxy groups, and Iran's position in the Middle East. It's definitely causing problems inside Iran and making a bigger conflict much more likely, especially with their nuclear program moving along.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, trying to understand all of this, the key thing is to grasp just how delicately everyone is treading. How do you deal with Iran's nukes and their destabilizing actions without starting a war that could be absolutely catastrophic? It's the question everyone's asking.
It really makes you think. What's the best way to calm things down and make the Middle East stable in the long run? We're talking about military power, tricky diplomacy, economics. It's a tangled mess that we need to keep paying attention to.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into this incredibly complex and important situation.